All right, the next block we're going to build is the footer. Now, this footer has a couple of challenging parts. On mobile, we have these collapsibles, but on desktop, we don't have collapsibles. So these collapsibles are always expanded. So what you need to do is to write a media query and hide the chevron and show the content area. That's one tricky part. The other tricky part is the placement of the logo. On desktop, it's placed in the first column, but on mobile, it's placed in the last row. So I want you to spend 20 minutes on implementing this, then come back see my solution. And by the way, for the footer, don't worry about this callout section. We'll add that later. So we just want to build the footer block. All right, we're going to add a footer element and give it a couple of classes like block and block dark. Now, as you know, block dark is going to give this a pure black background, but the footer that we have in our design mockup doesn't have a pure black background. The background is slightly lighter. So back to our markup, we're going to give this an additional class like footer. Now you might be wondering why I added this class if you're going to set the background in the footer class. Well, earlier we defined some styles for text on a dark block. So we set the color of the headings to white. I don't want to repeat those styles here. That's why I added this class, okay? So back to our style sheet. Here we're going to define a rule and set the background of the footer to 23, 23, 23. Take a look. Good. That's the right color. Now, back to our markup. Inside this footer, we're going to have a container, which happens to be a grid. So I'm going to place these items in a grid. On mobile, we have a 1-column grid. On desktop, we have a 5-column grid. So we have a grid. Now we need the template for a collapsible component. So let's bring up collapsible.html, grab all this code and paste it here. Good. Now I'm going to make a small change here. So in our template, we're representing a collapsible component using the div element. That's totally fine. But to make this markup more semantic, I'm going to replace this div with a section. So section. The reason I did this is because in our footer, we have multiple sections, okay? So here we have one section. Now I'm going to select this entire section and duplicate it a few times. And then change the labels. This one is going to be item 3 and the other one is going to be item 2. Let's see what we get up to this point. All right, we have 3 collapsibles and they're all expanded. So to make this more like our design mockup, I'm going to remove the expanded class from the last 2 collapsibles. So here we have a section for item 2. I'm going to remove the expanded class. Good. And one more time. Over here, delete. Now take a look. All right, that's closer to our design mockup. Next, we need to add some padding and a border between these items. So back to our markup, we're going to give each section an extra class for styling. What should we call this class? Footer _section, right? Now I'm going to repeat this for other sections. So here's one, and we have another section here. Good. And one more. Okay, back to our style sheet. Let's define a new rule and say our footer sections should have a padding of 2 rams and a border on the bottom that is 1 pixel solid with the color of 39, 39, 39. Take a look. All right, that's better. Now these items that we have here, they should be in uppercase and they should be slightly thinner. So once again, we need to give these headings an extra class. So here we have an H2. I'm going to give this an extra class like footer heading. Now you might be wondering why I'm not going to reuse this class for styling the heading. So couldn't we write a style like footer collapsible heading and then apply the styles here? We could certainly do this, but what if in the future we decide to remove these collapsibles and restructure this markup? So by assigning this specific class to our H2 element, we are defining this as an element inside the footer component. So our footer should have heading elements, and these headings should have a particular style, okay? Now, let's apply this class to other H2 elements. So here we have item 2. Let's add it here. And one more. Item 3. Good. Now the styles. So we're going to write footer heading. we're going to apply text transformation and make it uppercase. And we should also set the font weight to 600. Okay, that's better. Now let's add the logo and the copyright notice here. So back to our markup, here's the last section. After this, we're going to add another section and give it a class like footer brand. In this section, we're going to have an image. We're going to set the source to images/logo svg. And right below that, we're going to add a paragraph with the class of footer copyright. And here we say copyright 2020 Marsh Hamedani. Good. Now save the changes and let's see what we get. All right, here's what we get. There are two changes we need to apply here. We need to move this to the center and separate it from these items. So back to our style sheet, we're going to define a new rule and say footer brand should have a top margin of, let's say 5 rems. And the text align here should be center. Take a look. That's better. Next, we need to style the copyright notice. So we need one more rule, footer copyright. Here we're going to set the font size to 2.1 rems. The color should be white, but we should reduce the opacity to 0.3. I picked these numbers from our design mockup. So with this, we get this copyright notice. Great. So we've got the basics right. Now eventually we're going to replace these paragraphs with a list of hyperlinks. For now, I don't want to worry about it. So now we're going to work on the layout for tablets and wider screens. So we're going to write a media query for screens that are wider than 768 pixels. Here we're going to redefine the template of our grid. So back to our markup, here's our footer, and inside this footer we have a grid. Now once again, we can write a rule like footer grid, and that's probably going to work most of the time unless we add another grid in this footer for a different reason. In that case, we will want to give this element a specific class like footer sections, and then we don't have to worry about multiple grids in the footer. So let's rewrite this rule and say footer sections. Here we're going to set grid template columns to, what should we use? Well, one way is to use repeat and say 5 and 1FR. That is totally fine. But if in the future we decide to add another section or another category of links, then we'll have to come back and revisit our code. So earlier I showed you a technique. Here we can use autofit so the grid can fit as many items as it can. But autofit doesn't work with just 1FR. Here we have to use min-max and give it a minimum value, let's say 100 pixels or 10 rems, and a maximum of 1FR. So back to the browser, here's what we get. It's not too bad, but there are a few things we need to improve here. First, we need to remove these chevrons, and then we need to show the content of all these sections. So back to our markup, here's our first section. In this section, we have an SVG that represents our chevron. Now, just a side note, I think it would be better to call this class collapsible toggler as opposed to collapsible chevron, because maybe in one place we want to show a chevron, but in another place, like our navigation bar, we want to show a menu icon. Now, I don't want to get distracted with renaming this in the middle of finishing this job. So for now, we're going to use this class, and then later we can come back and improve our code. So we have this collapsible chevron. Now, we go back to our media query and write another rule and say, in our footer, if we have a collapsible chevron, that should be hidden. Now, take a look. All the chevrons are gone. Using a similar technique, we're going to show the content of each section. So back to our section. In each section, we have a collapsible content. So we're going to target this inside our footer. We're going to say, in our footer, if we have a collapsible content, it should be visible. But here we cannot set display to block because earlier we used a different technique for animating the expansion of this object. So here we have to set opacity to 1 and max height to 100% of its container. Now take a look. All these blocks are visible. Great. So next we need to move this logo and put it before all these categories or all these sections. So we're going to write a new rule and say, footer brand, we're going to change the order of this element. So by default, the order of all these grid items is 0. If we set this to -1, then it will move before the first item. Great. Now, if you make the browser wider, everything is going to work. The only problem is the size of this font. So here we're going to write a new rule and say our copyright notice should have the font size of 1.5 rems. Okay, that's better. Now we need to move this to the top. Let's see why we have some extra space here. So here's the section that represents our brand. Now look at the computer tab. We have 50 pixels of margin on the top. We added this earlier in this rule, footer brand, because on mobile, we wanted to separate this from the previous items, but we don't need this on wider screens. So back to this rule, we're going to set margin top to, let's say 1 rem. Now take a look. All right, that looks pretty good. Next, we need to remove the border below each section. So we need one more rule here and say footer sections should have no border. Good. And the last thing we need to improve is the size of these headings. They're a little bit too large. So let's add one more rule and say our footer headings should have a font size of 1.6 rems. Good. That is very close to what we have in our design mockup. So now I'm going to pause the recording and replace these paragraphs with hyperlinks. So in this collapsible content, I've added an unordered list with this class. And here we have 3 list items just as an example. Now, here's what we get. Let's see where this color is coming from. So inspect. We go to the computer tab and expand the color property. So this is coming from user agent. That is the default color that my browser has applied here. So we go back to the footer section and define a rule for all links in the footer. We're going to set their color to 777. We should also give them a hover effect. So if you hover on these links, the color should turn to pure white. And we want to apply this using a transition. So it looks really nice. Let's say 0.3 seconds. Good. All right, here's what we get. And we have this beautiful transition. Perfect. Now, one last thing. We need to get rid of this extra space. Let's inspect this element. So here's our collapsible content. Inside this, we have an unordered list. Now look at the computer tab. We have 18 pixels of margin above and below this item. Where is this coming from? Let's find out. So here we have margin block end that translates to margin bottom. And once again, this is defined in Chrome by default. So back to our style sheet. Here we can write a new rule and say, in a footer section, if we have a list, that list should have no margins. Of course, we could give this a specific class, but I think it's unnecessary for now. So let's move on and see what we get. All right, so I've added all these real labels and then found a problem. If we make the browser smaller, look at the logo, see what's happening? The reason this is happening is because we don't have a responsive image. So earlier we defined this rule for the brand section. Now I'm going to write a new rule and say, in the brand section, the image that we have should have a width of 100%. All right, now the problem is solved. Great. Now, if you have noticed, there have been a few places where I applied a width of 100% to our images. For this reason, a lot of people say it's a best practice to define a general rule for all images and set their width to 100%. I don't always agree with this opinion, so I don't want to apply this yet. I want to put everything together and make sure this is not going to cause an issue somewhere else. So here I'm going to leave a to-do comment, to-do. Consider refactoring this and applying it to all images. Okay. Let's do one last check before we finish this lesson. So on mobile, seems to be looking good. Now the logo is a little bit too big, and that's coming from this property. So here we can set max width to 230 pixels. That is the width of the image. And with this, the problem is gone. Great. So here's the mobile version. Now we have the tablet version, looks great. And finally, desktop. Perfect. So we're done with this block. Let's move on to the next lesson.